There are grand reminders of Roanoke's infancy and forgotten pieces of its past. Even abandoned railroad tracks lead back to a time rich in history, a time before the Star cast its first light, a time when Big Lick was the destination for trains carrying passengers and produce, a time when magic was in the air.
This was a hunting ground. And the animals were always, they had to have salt. So they came where the licks were. And that's why Roanoke managed to become a city, because the animals came here. The animals made the paths, the Indians used the paths, and the white men came and used them also.
The white man first explored this lush green valley nestled between Blue Mountains in 1671. Deer, buffalo, and bear called it home before the first settlers arrived. By the 1740s, families from the Shenandoah Valley and areas farther north, such as Maryland and Pennsylvania, started to settle the Roanoke Valley. Growth was slow, but by the 1800s there were 4 settlements in what is now known as the city of Roanoke. The town of Antwerp was chartered in 1801. Gainsboro followed in 1825, then Old Lick in 1834. Gainsboro was the largest until the town of Big Lick, with a population of more than 600, was established in 1874.
It was just sparsely settled by people who lived on big plantations. Their holdings ran at least $1,000 acres each. And they were plantation people, and of course Roanoke came as sort of they didn't care for it.
While small towns were cropping up in the Roanoke Valley, railroads were laying tracks in other states. The railroads moved slowly into Virginia. In 1850, the Commonwealth had less than 400 miles of track. In the United States as a whole, there was 9,000 miles of railroad. The first train rolled into Big Lick November 1st, 1852. The locomotives of the time looked much like this 22-ton wood burner. The Virginia and Tennessee ran just south of Gainsboro in 1852, changing the composition of the nearby towns. Gainsboro then became known as Old Lick. Businesses cropped up near the tracks on what is now known as 2nd Street, but then it was called Commerce. Predecessors of the Southern Railroad and the Norfolk and Western were born about the same time. The Richmond and Danville formed in 1847, the Norfolk and Petersburg in 1853. The South Side was completed in 1854, and the 204 miles of Virginia and Tennessee track were finished in 1856. The railroads would play a major role in the Civil War.
The Virginia and Tennessee was one of those essential railroads during the Civil War period. Supplies, horses, soldiers, wounded soldiers moved back and forth on the railroads in Virginia, and 3 of the major ones came to Lynchburg. The Virginia and Tennessee, coming up from Bristol and through what was then known as Big Lick, and then to Liberty, which we now know as Bedford, was a road that Abraham Lincoln described as the gut of the South.
Trains carried troops and supplies. Depots in the towns of Salem, Big Lick, Liberty, and Lynchburg were restocking centers for Virginia Confederates. We now know these towns as the cities of Salem, Roanoke, Bedford, and Lynchburg. During the war, the Yankees had burned depots and stores and destroyed tracks from Salem to Lynchburg. By the end of the Civil War, the Virginia and Tennessee and other railroads were in shambles. General William Mahone consolidated the Norfolk and Petersburg and the South Side and the Virginia and Tennessee in 1870. They became the Atlantic, Mississippi, and Ohio, linking Norfolk to Bristol with 408 miles of railroad track. Mahone received a unanimous vote for president and took in a controversial salary of $25,000 a year. the same as the President of the United States. The AM&O had shops in Lynchburg, making freight and passenger cars. Lynchburg was the railroad town Big Lick had yet to become. At the same time, a subsidiary of the Pennsylvania Railroad was organized. The Shenandoah Valley would eventually run 238 miles from Hagerstown, Maryland, to the town that would become the city of Roanoke. Mahone made sure the AM&O was rebuilt and most of the track replaced throughout the whole system. While the railroad was in top physical condition, an economic panic in 1873 doomed it financially. The AM&O went into receivership. Mahone continued improvements to the system, but a U.S. Circuit Court finally granted the foreclosure and sale in May of 1880 for $8,605,000. A Philadelphia banking firm, the E.W. Clark Company, took over, renaming the railroad the Norfolk and Western. The Clark Company was also involved with the Shenandoah Valley Railroad. The objective was to tap into the mineral deposits in far southwest Virginia and connect with the new N&W somewhere between Lynchburg and Salem. But the 1873 financial panic and bad weather slowed progress.
They had to close that gap. They had four options. They could have connected at Salem, they could have connected at Big Lick, at Bonsack, or at Montvale. And in their minutes of April of 1881, they mentioned Bonsack as the desired connection point.
Frederick Kimball, the man who could probably be called the father of modern-day Roanoke, was already working his way to Big Lick as the president of the Shenandoah Valley Construction Company. Under Kimball, tracks connecting Hagerstown to Waynesboro were finished rapidly. Rumors of the Shenandoah Valley Railroad passing near Big Lick had been circulating for years. At the time, the town was one of 100 households, 5 churches, 5 tobacco factories, plus a cigar factory. Of course, there was a post office, bank, newspaper, and the population of nearly 670 shopped at the 10 stores and used the services of the undertaker, 4 doctors, and 2 lawyers. But it was not a sure thing the 2 railroads would intersect at Big Lick. Orchard owner and farmer John C. Moomaw worked to make it a reality. Moomaw organized the citizens of Big Lick to sign a petition, donate an acre of land, and raise money, an amount somewhere between $5,000 to $15,000. After the Clarks took over the AM&O, headquarters were moved from Lynchburg to Big Lick. Estimates at the time said moving the AM&O, or rather the newly named N&W headquarters, to Big Lick brought in 170 officers and employees. Bringing in the Shenandoah Valley Railway Organization added 200 more people. The N&W bought 800 acres of land for shops. The old AM&O shops moved from Lynchburg, adding about 700 employees to the population, and the new foundry was expected to employ 100 more.
There's an old sort of anti-industrial folk tale here in Lynchburg. They claim that, the tellers of this tale claim that the shoe factories and the clothing factories here didn't want the shops to expand here, and that they drove them out of town. And that's not really the case. Essentially, there wasn't enough room here to do it. The shops were confined to a small piece of land down on the riverbank. The yard was located literally on an island in the middle of the James River. It was only 1.25 miles long. It was less than 300 yards wide. And you think about those sizes, 3-4 football fields, and Schaefer's Crossing and those yards today, you could never have done that here. Hundreds of men worked in those shops from 1880 until, well, they still work there. And it's been a place of employment. It's been a place where, families have worked for generations, and men have worked there their entire lives. So that creates an economy. I mean, they have to live somewhere, and they have to eat, and they have to buy clothes and a car and TV, and today a VCR and whatever else they need. Well, that's what makes a local economy work.
These moves marked unprecedented growth. The town was growing so fast, citizens called it the Magic City because buildings just seemed to sprout up overnight. Between the beginning of 1881 and the summer of 1882, the railroad built about 140 houses. Other businesses cropped up: a mill, 2 office buildings, and 15 stores. The October 12, 1882 Roanoke Leader told residents the city was receiving national attention because the city's population grew from 300 in 1881 to nearly 3,500 in 1 year. A growth management plan was needed, so in July 1881, railroad officials and the Philadelphia financial backers created the Roanoke Land and Improvement Company. This company's purpose was to acquire land needed by the railroad and create a plan to help the N&W meet the needs of all the people moving into the town to work for the railroad. When railroad officials decided to intersect the Shenandoah Valley and the Norfolk and Western at Big Lick, residents wanted to change the town's name. Kimball was their first choice in honor of the man they credited for creating the union between the town and the railroad. Frederick Kimball declined the honor, and Roanoke, the Indian word for money, was chosen. The General Assembly granted the town's charter February 3, 1882. The N&W absorbed the Shenandoah Valley Railroad in December of 1890. Growth seemed to be peaking as the city neared its 10th anniversary. Roanoke added the Academy of Music. Construction of the Terry Building, what was then called the finest structure in Virginia, was complete. Newspaper advertisements in October of 1891 laid out the Roanoke Development Company's plans for future growth, specifically mentioning new business and residential districts. Lots 40 by 150 feet were selling for $125 to $150, or at the discounted rate of $100 a lot when bought in blocks of 10. Norfolk and Western was credited for creating the Roanoke Development Company and making this growth possible. As the new city entered 1892, newspaper banners called Roanoke the Young Chicago of the South. The Roanoke Machine Works payroll topped all businesses in February 1892 at $35,000. N&W Railroad Roundhouse paid out $27,000, and the N&W General Offices doled out $23,000. The evidence seemed to prove Roanoke was truly the Magic City. Roanoke chose to celebrate its 10th birthday on June 18, 1892, the 10th anniversary of the connection of the Shenandoah Valley Railroad and the Norfolk and Western at the city.
Up to the time the railroad moved in, it was nothing in the world but a village. But instead of one doctor, they had 8. Instead of one place that you could spend the night, they had 16 of them. All of a sudden, the place was full of people, and you had to do something about those people. And you turned up with all kinds of things that you never had before, like a place to have shoes made, somebody to wait on you in various and sundry things that you never had before. It blossomed.
The population was mostly men responsible for constructing new homes and buildings or clearing land to make way for the railroad. By 1893, Roanoke boasted 25,000 residents. This was no ordinary southern town. It was more like a frontier town. Historian Claire White says at one time, Salem Avenue was dotted with 46 saloons.
This particular area out here was very much like Wild West. Anything went. And I think that was probably exactly right. And anything went meant that if you could get by with it with law, that's as far as you took it.
But a grand old lady would add a bit of elegance to this railroad town. Frederick Kimball's foresightedness wasn't solely focused on the railroad. In 1881, he was president of the Shenandoah Valley Railway. While Kimball saw the value of the railroad tapping into the mineral deposits in far southwest Virginia, he also had visions of a more refined Roanoke.
Big Lick was certainly unsophisticated. When the old Atlantic, Mississippi, and Ohio Railroad gave up the ghost, It was acquired by a Philadelphia banking interest. And Philadelphia in that time, of course, was a very sophisticated place. The people who came here for the Norfolk Western Railroad, as it was then.
Soon after the decision to intersect the two railroads at Big Lick, Kimball and some of the town's business leaders were taking a walking tour of the village. The tour stopped at a wheat field on a hill overlooking the town. Kimball reportedly remarked, "What a good site for a hotel, and at the foot of the hill, a passenger station." The Hotel Roanoke opened its doors October of 1882.
They laid out lots, they laid out streets, planted trees, and all the rest of it. At the same time, they built a hotel. And the city fathers were not pleased when they built a hotel on what was described as a pretty field of wheat.
The hotel not only added a touch of class to the burly railroad town, it also brought the latest technology into the valley. Even in the early years, the Hotel Roanoke had the luxury of private baths as well as hot and cold water.
Well, the very first hotel, 1882, they had hot water, yes, but you had to ring the complicated system of bells and speaking tube to have it brought to you. It did have, the hotel had private baths, and I've been in rail hotels since where that was, believe it or not, that was not always available.
Ahead of its time, the Hotel Roanoke offered guests the ability to order room service and contact hotel staff by way of speaking tubes and an elaborate bell system.
The railroad management always was concerned, dedicated, if you like, to making sure the hotel was what we call cutting edge now up front. Yes, the first sewers, the first electric lights, but there was always right up front. It occupied not just a physical center of the city, but the social center as well. It became the place to go.
The Hotel Roanoke was the jewel of the Norfolk and Western. Dignitaries on railroad business were housed there. Over the years, the hotel opened its doors to presidents, entertainers, and beauty queens. It also symbolized growth and inspired hope during difficult times. The railroad rebuilt the hotel after a fire in 1898, built a three-story addition in 1916, as well as another addition including a garage during the Great Depression of 1931. While the United States was still in an economic recovery, the Norfolk and Western spent $1 million in 1938 and $1.5 million 9 years later, adding a new wing plus air conditioning and fireproofing the entire hotel.
That expressed enormous confidence in the future of the city and the willingness of the railroad to spend money, as I mentioned earlier, to keep the hotel top of the line. In 1931, a depression year, when there were people not working, that was a substantial investment. It put electric fans in every room. It put tub showers in every room, and closet doors that, my goodness, open the door and the light goes on. I mean, this is top of the line in 1931. At the same time, the railroad was building its, what is now the General Office Building North. Well, for now it's the Education Center. But those have five floors, elevator, some terrific Art Deco stuff in it. And this was a 5-story office building for a railroad in the Depression. This is, I think, an incredible, bold gesture on the part of the railroad management. We are here. We're going to stay. It's a depression, but we're going to come out of it. And indeed, they did. Never look back.
The cutting-edge qualities of the Hotel Roanoke mirrored what was happening in the Norfolk and Western shops. Roanoke would soon become known for creating some of the best steam locomotives in the world.
Those engines had a reputation beyond Roanoke, beyond Virginia. When you line up their qualities, tractive effort, fuel economy, the power of those engines, they rank right at the top. So in America, Roanoke's locomotives are considered some of the best ever built.
My father was agent for the Norfolk and Western in Norfolk, and his father was a telegrapher on the Atlantic Coastline Railroad, which was now later consumed by the CSX people. And his father was an engineer on the old RF&P during the Civil War.
My father worked for the railroad for 40-some years. His father worked his entire career at the railroad. My mother's father worked there for a short time, and his father worked there also. In fact, as he came from England as a young teenager in the 1830s and ultimately ended up as a conductor on the railroad. So there's a long history of railroad environment. When I first got out of law school, I worked for them myself for a short period of time in their legal work. I remember as a child this tremendous sense of security in having my father be a railroad worker in Roanoke, that there was this real sense of family, that the railroad was committed to the people that worked there and they looked after each other.
The railroad wasn't a family-owned business, but it felt like a family in Roanoke because nearly everyone worked at the railroad. Roanoke was growing because the Norfolk and Western was growing. Efforts to tap into coal-rich far southwest Virginia had been successful. Coal shipments from West Virginia to Norfolk began in the 1880s. The demand for coal spurred the growth in N&W freight tonnage and revenues in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. In 1905, Norfolk and Western shipped a record 8.18 million tons of coal. That number climbed to 26 million tons by 1920. Roanoke's population was nearly 21,500 in 1900. By 1910, it had climbed to almost 39,000. The little Virginia city was becoming more sophisticated as well. In 1904, an anti-cow ordinance was passed, so cows would no longer be able to roam the streets. The city paved Jefferson, Campbell, and First with brick in 1906. And streetcars moved people throughout the city. In 1910, a young man would begin his career with Norfolk and Western. Robert Racehorse Smith would impact Roanoke and the N&W. Smith was a student at Princeton at the time and tutoring the son of N&W general manager Nicholas Maher.
So my father was looking for a job, so he gave him a job as an axeman cutting away weeds and brush from the railroad. That's the way he started. So he came up through the ranks in a wonderful way.
Maher helped Smith get hired as an axeman and chainman on a surveying gang. Some call Smith the last working president of the railroad, a title he earned by working his way through the ranks. Smith took the helm of the N&W in 1946. He was the last president to literally walk the line, walking nearly every mile of N&W track during his career.
It was the summertime. They all came with their white suits and lovely outfits on, and they said, well, Mr. Smith, what train are we catching? They were going to, I think it was Christiansburg. We're just going up there for some meeting. And they said, which train are we catching? He says, we're not going on a train, we're walking. So they all, those businessmen, they all walked to Christiansburg.
They lived where Lot's funeral home is now, the main chapel. And he would walk to work in the morning, walk home for lunch, have a cup of strong black coffee, a salad and a sandwich, walk back to work, and then walk home and work in his garden till supper time.
During this time, the city of Roanoke was literally growing, adding more than 9 square miles through 5 annexations from 1882 to 1943. Roanoke and Norfolk and Western had survived World War I and even thrived. American Visco Corporation, which made rayon, opened in 1917. By 1919, it employed 1,700 people. By 1928, that figure was about 5,000. Roanoke and the N&W boasted the largest railroad shop in the South in 1930. But the transportation industry was shifting from railroads and streetcars to automobiles and airplanes. Roanoke leased 125 acres of an old plantation on the north side of town to build an airport and pulled up the streetcar tracks. The Great Depression was upon the country, but it never really impacted Roanoke or the N&W. At its height, Roanoke's unemployment was less than 2%. Roanoke's railroad shops were aglow from activity morning, noon, and night. The craftsmen were building engines from the ground up, turning raw materials into locomotives, which would become world-renowned.
You're talking about men who could take literally a slab of metal and make a high tensile reciprocating part, a side rod, for example, that connected the wheels, that would spin around 100 times a minute at high speed, and do that for years and years and years. And it was beautiful. All of the lines were very finely wrought.
Well, Roanoke Shops at that time was the principal mechanical facility for the Norfolk and Western. They overhauled locomotives on a routine basis, but they also built new locomotives from scratch. They were designed by Norfolk and Western people. The castings were made in the foundry. The forgings were built in the blacksmith shop. The boilers were built in the boiler shop. The various components that required machining were machined in the machine shop, all put together in the erecting shop.
They weighed 100 tons or more. You and I together could probably get behind one with the brakes off and push it because it was so finely tuned and could roll so freely. And of course, that meant it cost a lot less to operate.
At the height of its skill, the Roanoke Shops rolled out the Magnificent Three: the Class A, the Y6B, and the Class J. The Class A was powerful and imposing. It routinely pulled 150-car coal trains. That translates into 11,000 tons and over a mile in length. The designing of this locomotive required 11,000 man-hours. The front of the engine was hinged, allowing it to maneuver tight curves. The Class A 1218 rolled out of the shops June 2, 1943, at a cost of nearly $164,000. The Y6B was assigned duty hauling heavy freight in the mountainous territory. 17 Y6Bs were built between April 1948 and July 1949. The N&W Class J was considered the more superior design of the Magnificent Three before the railroad switched to diesel. It's said the engine could reach speeds of 140 miles per hour, though it was never operated at more than 110 miles per hour. This while hauling 15 cars on a level track. Normal speed was 80 miles per hour. The last surviving J now sits in the Roanoke Museum of Transportation. The 611 rolled out of the shops May 29, 1950.
When the 611 was built and completed on May 29, 1950, it was built at Roanoke Shops, and in the afternoon of May 29th, it came up to Schaefer's Crossing, getting ready to enter service. And I was working at the coal wharf, and I helped put the first load of sand in the sand domes before it entered service.
Norfolk and Western, for example, had high-speed, streamlined, air-conditioned passenger trains prior to World War II. Trains that ran on certain parts of their track at almost 100 miles an hour.
I don't think the public was really aware of all this until the N&W stuck with steam for so long and really gained national prominence.
But the days of steam were numbered. Other railroads across the country began to experiment with diesel.
We were not allowed to use the word diesel in the House. He was very much for the coal industry, and so that was part of it.
But I think the Norfolk and Western really came into prominence when it was the last major railroad to retain steam locomotives, and was still building and operating steam locomotives when many other railroads had dieselized. And they continued building them through 1953 and did not begin dieselizing until 1955. So I think that had a lot to do with the public, the general public, knowing it's of the Norfolk and Western, and rail enthusiasts came here from literally all over the world to photograph the N&W and its latter days of steam.
Robert Racehorse Smith was the N&W president as the 1950s drew to a close. He loved steam. While other railroads had moved on to diesel, the N&W was still making a profit while using its efficient steam locomotives. In 1954, the N&W made its last effort to try to keep steam power. A coal-fired steam turbine electric drive unit called John Henry was supposed to keep the railroad in steam, but it was too costly to manufacture. Smith retired as president March 31, 1958. In 1959, the railroad retired its last steam locomotive. It took 5 years to convert to diesel. Jobs in Roanoke shops were lost during the process.
They overhauled diesels, but the amount of work required was much less. Required almost no boiler makers, fewer foundrymen, fewer blacksmiths, fewer machinists, and it had quite an impact on Roanoke shops and on the city of Roanoke. But the shops continued working with reduced forces and adapted to the diesels quite well. But it was difficult for the people in certain crafts for which there was no longer a need.
It was a bad time in Roanoke because it also coincided with the huge layoffs at American Viscose, which was another technologically driven thing that rayon, the artificial silk, was basically went out of vogue and was overtaken by other synthetic fibers.
Jobs did not return to the Roanoke shops until the diesel fleet started needing repairs. Bill Mason's father was laid off for 3 years. Passenger rail service had been declining for some time, and in 1971, Amtrak took over most passenger operations. Penn Central entered bankruptcy in 1970. Many other railroads went belly up. Conrail was formed during this time.
It was offset to some extent by the mergers which took place in 1959 and 1964. In 1959, the Norfolk and Western and Virginian railways merged. Roanoke remained the headquarters for Norfolk and Western. In 1964, there was a merger between the Norfolk and Western and the Nickel Plate and Wabash and some smaller railroads. And Roanoke became the headquarters of a system which just about tripled in size.
Roanoke was changing as well. A new 400-bed hospital was built. Community Hospital was finished in 1967. The Roanoke Civic Center was dedicated March 27, 1971, and Roanoke's first black mayor, Reverend Noel C. Taylor, was elected in 1975. The decade drew to a close. The last leg of Interstate 581 through the city was completed in 1980. As Roanoke neared its 100th birthday, the historic farmers market was getting a facelift. The open-air market has been operating since 1874. It's the oldest continuously operating open-air market in Virginia. 1982 would bring changes for Norfolk Western as well. Changes that actually started in the late 1970s. N&W and Southern Railway started talking consolidation. In April of 1979, N&W President John Fishwick and his Southern Railway counterpart said they would study the matter. At the time, a consolidation would have made the third largest rail system in the nation. In a letter to employees, Fishwick said, "New developments can bring uncertainty. I think this would be a great thing for all of us." He goes on to say N&W would continue to have its headquarters in Roanoke and would carry on the same operations and functions. But an article appearing on the same day titled "Railroad's Main Office Location Would Affect Roanoke's Business" had a more foreshadowing message. A bank vice president is quoted as saying, "All of our financial planning is affected by any major shifts in philosophy or operations by the railroad." He goes on to say if consolidation of administrative offices were to pull corporate officers out of Roanoke, then we'd be the losers. Consolidation talks broke off in October of 1979. To say Roanoke and N&W grew up together wouldn't quite tell the story. Life in Roanoke revolved around the railroad. On railroad paydays, banks in the Magic City would stay open late. Roanoke was always on railroad time. At one time, daylight savings time was not observed.
I don't know that a lot of people are aware why watches and accurate time was so important to railroaders. And the reason is it's how they control their train movements. That a lot of the railroad system only had a single track. and they had trains going in both directions on that track. And there were areas, of course, where there were double tracks, and they could shuttle the trains off and pass each other on these double tracks. And how they managed that was based on time. And a train got a conductor got his orders. The train was supposed to move through different sections of the track at certain times of the day. And I've been told that the reason they didn't use the daylight savings time is because it would make that more complicated. And if that timing was ever off, there was a great incidence of train wrecks.
By the 1980s, times had changed, but Roanoke had not. It still lived off the railroad. The consolidation of the Chessie and Seaboard systems, which created CSX, as well as the consolidation of other railroads across the nation, would impact Roanoke. June 1980, consolidation talks between Norfolk and Western and Southern Railways had reopened. Both companies were now seeking approval from their boards of directors for a merger. By late July, the directors okayed the merger. N&W's 7,500 miles of track would be combined with Southern's 10,000 miles. The plan was to create a holding company and leave N&W and Southern as separate companies, each maintaining their own headquarters. The holding company would also have an office in a third location to run a joint system. A formal application was filed in early December 1980. In it, a plan to possibly bring 200 more jobs to Roanoke. Southern didn't have the car shops, so more employees would be needed to meet the demand for more hopper cars. Now the railroads just had to wait for approval by the Interstate Commerce Commission. The year of Roanoke's centennial, the consolidation of N&W and Southern Railways created Norfolk Southern Corporation. The NS Tower headquarters officially opened in Norfolk, Virginia in 1989. The railroad executives, their money and business moved east as well.
The effect, and followed a few years later by the consolidation of Norfolk and Western and Southern Railway, was a major blow. Now when that happened, even though we had the office building, the new office building, there was a loss not just of bodies and a closed building. It was a departure of leadership, participation, dollars, oh yes, dollars. That a lot of the people who moved away were board members and board officers, volunteers, membership payers, that kind of thing. It left the city in a very bad way.
The railroad here had always been a major leader in the nonprofits in the valley. And obviously the people that were here, there were a lot of people here that had very large salaries. And those people, as a result of that, had more discretionary income. And they were significant contributors financially to any number of nonprofit organizations in the Roanoke Valley.
Don Piedmont was working in the railroad's public relations department at the time and was left wondering whether he was staying in Roanoke or going.
I asked my vice president one day in what I thought was a genteel understatement. I said, am I going to Norfolk? Because I grew up in Norfolk. To the extent I grew up, it was in Norfolk. I said, Bill, it would help my planning if I knew, am I going to Norfolk? And he said, bless his heart, he said, no, Don, all the creative people are going to Norfolk. You can stay in Roanoke. Oh, thank you, I think. Then there was a lot of accounting functions left here. Police, big motive power section, of course. Coal traffic, merchandise traffic also. Whereas the Norfolk Southern building here was at one time very crowded. I think you probably have handball games in some of the offices.
In 1979, Norfolk Southern donated the Hotel Roanoke to Virginia Tech. The 107-year-old landmark built by N&W closed its doors November 30th of that year, pouring salt into the wound of a city still smarting from the exodus of the railroad executives.
First of all, the social center, as I called it earlier, was gone. The great lunch place was gone. Why it was gone, of course, is a long story about the interstate highway system, among other things, decline of passenger traffic, which was a result of the interstate, and so on and so on. But it left a big hole in the city.
A sale of the hotel contents started December 4th. Don Piedmont watched from his office as a line of people formed all the way around the hotel. They walked away with lamps, chairs, and dinner plates, material representations of memories of happier days. Piedmont did not go to the sale.
What I did end up with was a bride. My wife and I, she wasn't then, had our first date in the Fountain Room, which was a glitzy little place in the basement. So that's what I brought from Hotel Roanoke.
A tall fence was put up around the hotel, and the grand old lady laid in state for 4 years. The grand old lady on the hill had been a symbol of success for Norfolk and Western and Roanoke. As the railroad and city grew, so did the Hotel Roanoke. In 1993, ground was broken for the hotel's new convention and conference center. The old lady was about to get a facelift.
Thanks to tech and its management, we're back in business. In the same place where Mr. Kimball says, here we are.
2 years and millions of dollars later, guests were welcomed back to the Hotel Roanoke. In the late 1990s, railroad consolidations were still leaving an impact on Roanoke. Norfolk Southern launched an offer for Conrail in 1996 to block a proposed Conrail-CSX consolidation. A year later, NS and CSX filed a joint application to divide the routes and assets of Conrail. In June 1998, the Surface Transportation Board approved the application. Norfolk Southern began operating 7,200 miles of Conrail track June 1, 1999. The railroad now served 22 states with 21,600 miles of track. Consolidation spelt job loss for Roanoke once again. 228 Roanoke car shop workers found themselves without a job in August of 2000. That same month, Roanoke's East End shops went from 238 employees to 16. More furloughs were to come. NS blamed a drop in coal transportation, a slowing economy, and the Conrail consolidation.
That they really didn't have any choice. That if they let the chassis system acquire in the entire Conrail system, that it would, in the long term, have hurt the railroad here drastically. And that they understandably understood that there would be a short-term difficult period in assimilating and dealing with the debt and the cost of what they bought. And there were administrative problems, as there is with any large endeavor. And I think they have rightfully traded the short-term difficulties for a very large, long-term betterment of the company.
Roanoke has been looking to better itself, and now it isn't looking to the railroad for help. Beth New says Roanoke will use its past as a foundation.
First of all, of course, is the Hotel Roanoke, which was built by Norfolk Western Railroad in the late 1800s. Then next door to the hotel, of course, was their original headquarters building. The first building, which is now being renovated for apartments, and the second building, which is now the Higher Education Center. So that's very significant, first of all, in the architectural history of our community, and then the fact that the railroad was willing to work with the city and the Redevelopment Housing Authority and now the Higher Education Coalition folks to put those buildings into use.
One day, Roanoke hopes to be known for technology and research. In 1999, Carilion Health System, Virginia Tech, and the University of Virginia announced the joint creation of the Carilion Biomedical Institute. The institute funds research and assists researchers with the commercialization of inventions. The city has bought out businesses on the west side of town to acquire property for constructing buildings to house future research firms and the headquarters of the Biomedical Institute. It's a project that will take 15 to 20 years to complete.
I think we all have to realize that no matter what your base was 50 or 60 years ago, it's probably not your community's economic base today. And we recognized that probably many years ago, and now are making some conscious efforts and decisions to diversify the economy in Roanoke. And of course, we're developing the biomedical park, and part of that's going to be along the railroad and acquiring some acreage from the railroad to develop that area. But that's a real conscious effort to look to economies and jobs that will be available to the future.
Tourism is a big part of Roanoke's plan for the future. City leaders are hoping Roanoke's railroad pass will lure visitors to the area. O. Winston Link introduced N&W locomotives to the world with his dramatic black and white photographs. The hope is a new museum bearing his name will bring railroad enthusiasts from all over the world to Roanoke. Before his death in January 2001, Link handpicked the old N&W passenger station as the home for his photographs. The building had been vacant for some time and needed more than $9 million in renovations. The first floor houses the Visitor and Convention Bureau. The old passenger station features have been restored, and there's room for several exhibit spaces. The lower level tells Link's story. Never trained in photography, Link gained unprecedented access to N&W trains. Robert Racehorse Smith was president of Norfolk and Western at the time and allowed Link to document the final days of steam.
In late December, he was photographing, I think it was the Birmingham Special East. This was a train that ran from Birmingham, Alabama to, I think, New York City. And it came through very early in the morning, came through Max Meadows. And Winston was all set up. He'd been photographing there and had photographed several trains. But when the train came through, it was making black smoke. And Winston had promised the railroad he'd try not to photograph trains making black smoke. And this was a beautiful photograph, streamlined engine. So he called, went to the telephone box, called the dispatcher in Roanoke. And I would say it took some nerve, because he said, would you mind stopping this train and having it back up? And the dispatchers did it. Now you might expect that on a freight train, fine, gets in, you know, an hour or two late, who cares? But for a passenger train, for a scheduled passenger train, that is really unusual. So they did. They stopped the train, backed it up 15 miles, whatever, and it came through again, making perfect white smoke. And because they didn't support it financially, but they wanted Winston to get the best pictures possible. But once the people got over a little bit of shyness, and I think once they heard he was from New York, and everybody thought, oh, they're all crazy up in New York. But once they got over that, they realized that Winston's interests were not ironic or distance. He wasn't making fun of the people who lived there, anything of that sort. He was deeply, deeply serious and respectful in recording the life of the railroad and the lives of the people who lived along it. And once that happened, people, you know, that innate Southern sense of hospitality and graciousness came out, and Winston time and again acknowledged how kind people were to a total stranger. Come in, have dinner. Yes, of course. You want to photograph in my living room? Absolutely. You want to develop your film in my bathroom? No problem. And you know, this would have been quite different, I think, that if he'd gone up to Brooklyn and knocked on a few doors. And he really appreciated that.
The museum exhibits illustrate Link's feat was no easy task.
Remember, many of them are made at night, so that there's the drama of the darkness against which, you know, these flashes of light come out, and so they are they're not what we see, because generally these scenes would be in complete blackness. We have to remember that except for the few thousandths of a second when the flash bulbs were blazing, it was black, and I mean really black when you're out there in the country. So that's why it's dramatic, because it's something, and compelling because it's something you've never seen before, and because it was never done before, and you couldn't go out and see it today.
Times have changed, and so has Roanoke. In 1928, Norfolk and Western employed more than 5,000 people in the Roanoke area and was the city's largest employer. Now the railroad Norfolk Southern employs almost 1,400, and Carilion Health Systems is the largest employer. A group made up of citizens and city officials is trying to bring passenger rail service back to Roanoke. Norfolk Southern does not oppose the idea. And a preliminary plan being tossed around by NS would make Roanoke a crossroad for two major rail corridors, making the Star City a railroad hub once again. But city officials will tell you they're looking to a diversified business community to keep magic in the air.
Well, the brakeman waves from the red caboose. It's a part of the past that never quite turns loose.